Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Sarah Abash Jacobson, the Barbara Rabin Chief Education Officer here at the Dallas Holocaust and Human Rights Museum. And I'd like to thank you for joining us for our first program of the 2026 Spring Break Survivor Speaker Series. Today you will hear from Mr. Andras Lacko, who was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1936, and he survived the Holocaust in a military hospital and was later reunited with his mother and father after the Soviet liberation/invasion of Budapest, because it's both things. Before we begin, I would like to thank our community partners for the Summer Speaker Survivor Series, Ackerman Center for Holocaust Studies at the University of Texas, Dallas, Southwest Jewish Congress, and the Texas Holocaust, Genocide, and Anti-Semitism Advisory Commission. We are grateful for your support of the museum and our programs. I would also like to extend a special welcome to our board members, generations, and volunteers in the audience. We could not fulfill our mission without you. If you are interested in becoming a museum volunteer or member, please visit our website at dhhrm.org to learn more. I also wanted to recognize Cooper High School, who is visiting here today. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. In just a moment, Dr. Lacko will share his story with you. Then we will have time for questions and answers. If you are joining us in person today, you can use the card provided to you at check-in to write out your questions, and our staff will be around at the end of Dr. Lacko's talk to pick those up. If you are joining us online, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type out and submit your questions. I now ask you to silence your cell phones so that we may all listen to Dr. Lacko's story without disruption. If you're not sure how to do that, turn to the child and or youngster to the right or the left of you. They can help you do that. Please also refrain from recording the presentation. We will be posting a recording of his talk on our YouTube channel, so you will be able to watch it there. It is now my great pleasure to turn things over to Dr. Lacko.
Thank you, Dr. Abash. It's my privilege to begin the series this year and try to recall some of the memories that happened about 80 years ago. In that time, of course, 2 or 3 generations have grown up, and certainly the younger generations, I find, at times know very little, if anything, about what happened during the Holocaust. That, of course, is not the only role that I feel that I can fulfill here. We have had, as you probably already noticed or heard, had very dramatic increase in anti-Semitism, not only in this country, but pretty much all over the world. For someone who started this journey a long time ago, and I was exposed to at least some of the inconveniences and atrocities of the Holocaust, it is rather depressing for me to see this type of activity and these type of feelings come to the forefront and raise their ugly head. So maybe some of you in the question and answer session can tell me, what do you think might be, in your view, the main reason for this? That we see people mourning the death of the Iranian leader, the Ayatollah, who dozens of times declared death to America, death to Israel, and I'm sure he also means death to the Jews. That the last time we heard repeated so many times and being part of a country's political aim go back 80 years to the Nazi regime in Germany, led by one of the cruelest and most demented person who ever lived, speaking of Adolf Hitler. But rather than going into bits and pieces of historical events, I'm going to begin a presentation which consists of a number of slides, and I'll try to explain to you what it meant to the Jewish people in Hungary, which is where I was born, in East Central Europe, and also what it might mean to people even today once we get an opportunity to learn about experiences and draw conclusions as to how one might avoid atrocities, mass killings, and all the well-detailed happenings that leave us with very sad memories at times. So, first of all, I want to show you the place where Hungary is located. If you haven't seen it before, it's right in the middle of the European continent. And in an enlarged picture, you see the country that is very much truncated because of the decisions that were made by the enemies of Hungary in the First World War, and a lot of the surrounding countries took big chunks of Hungary. In fact, Hungary lost 55% of its territory after the First World War, which ended in 1918. So why is this important? Well, this, of course, resulted a lot of apprehension, a lot of anger, a lot of hate, some of which actually got directed toward the Jewish community, which in Hungary at that time has grown to close to a million citizens, and had very prominent role in the film industry, in medicine, in academics, and a whole bunch of other areas that had a great deal of positive influence. And yet, the anti-Semitic law started in Hungary in the early 20s, and then they just kept increasing from there. So this is the scene where my story begins. I was born in the capital city of Budapest in 1936, and you see, first of all, my parents in the middle, who were married in 1934, and then the next result was my birth in 1936. You see me in my favorite place on my first birthday, in a bed. I was told that I actually fell out of this bed and hit my head. So whatever strange things I happened to do or act strange ways was attributed in part to being hit over the head, or landing on my head. In the far right, there's a family of my mother's who gathered together on the occasion for their wedding. A couple of individuals I'm going to point out. First of all, my parents are right there. That is my grandfather. That is my great-grandmother. This gentleman right here next to my father is the father of this young lady. The reason I'm pointing them out, because of all the people that you see up there, even though some of them died at home, including my great-grandmother, but our whole extended family, including a number of other people, those are the only two. The young lady here and this gentleman, who was her father. They were the ones who were picked up on the streets in Hungary in 1944, and they were quickly taken to Auschwitz, and we never heard of them after that. So this is the beginning. Now you see some exciting events that I was being part of, including nursery school. You see me in a devil's costume, which many people felt was the most appropriate wear I should have, considering my behavior at the time. And then you see my early musical attempts, which not much later switched to the piano, where I was a little more successful. And on the right you see me trying to find the right station on the radio, which was strictly fiction. My parents felt that this was a good picture, but they knew they wouldn't even let me close to the radio or receiver any time, because they knew I would find a way to ruin it somehow. Well, these pictures, I guess, could be perceived as peaceful, middle-class existence. And some of the funny things I said. The amazing thing is that these pictures were taken in 1941 and 42, at which time already most of the European Jewish population perished due to the meticulous planning and execution of the German Nazi government that actually organized a special meeting outside Berlin in the vacation place called Wannsee, and there military experts, industrial leaders, engineers, physicians got together and designed the ways of how, with the proper railroad transportation, which was only proper from the point of view of speed. If you saw the railroad car upstairs and you were told that maybe 100 people were squeezed into one of those cars, and when those people were given hardly anything to eat or drink for 2 days, when they were transported from their homes into the death camps, it's certainly not a very appropriate transportation, but it was speedy enough to move on with the extermination of the Jewish population of Europe, which again, by the time these pictures were taken inside Hungary, it was already mostly done. So how could this happen? Well, Hungary was the ally of Germany. And the Germans let Hungarians take care of their own Jewish population. And fortunately for us, the Hungarian government, even though they imposed laws with restrictions against the Jewish population, they did not result in deportation and certainly not in death. So we could live a reasonably normal life. My parents could continue to operate their grocery store and have pretty much a normal living, while again, the rest of the Jewish population all over Europe certainly was either killed or put under tremendous strain. So this is the background that preceded the Holocaust in Hungary. Here you see the timetable that gives you an idea of how this actually unfolded. I mentioned March 1944. That was the day the Wehrmacht, the German military units, entered Hungary and actually occupied the country because they no longer trusted the existing government. In fact, the Hungarian government was conducting clandestine negotiations with the British government, trying to find a separate peace agreement. And that is the reason why, once the Germans realized what was going on, plus they wanted to get more advanced positions to oppose the Russian army that was moving in from the east toward eventually Germany. And that's, of course, the war ended. So this is when the trouble began for us in real terms, and this happened very quickly. Even though the Germans had a great deal of shortage of rolling stock, and they needed the railroad cars and railroad transportation for the military, they, as long as possible, put aside enough that by June 1944 and July, which were the months that most of the Hungarian Jewish population was actually exterminated, killed in the death camps, that was the most efficient way that the Nazi German authorities learned from experience, as well as their planning, to have the most efficient system to take care of this. Round up the Jews, put them into railroad cars, take them to the death camps, and exterminate most of them, which were north in what is now Poland, and that's where the most infamous place, Auschwitz, or Auschwitz, they call it now in Polish, that's where it took place. And that happened in June and July 1944. In Hungary, if we just go back a little bit here, and I'll show you a little bit on the map. Well, actually, there's another map here. This is a lot better. This one. The little dots show on the map of Hungary the Jewish communities as well as synagogues that existed. And as you can see, this population was widespread. Even though the largest group lived in Budapest, which is where the arrow points, there were about 100,000 Jews living in the city, but there were about 900,000 Jews, especially heavily populating in the northeast corner that were highly exposed once the military units went to round up the Jewish population, take them to the railroad station, put them into the railroad cars, and then arrange for the driving north from here to what is now Poland, which is up there. It's a little further north. And here you can see even better. Auschwitz was located about there. So this is the way the Holocaust transpired. This is how it came about in Hungary. And now I'm going to tell you about my family's exposure to the Holocaust and what happened to us along with the rest of the population of the capital city, Budapest. So first of all, I want to focus your interest on the lower left-hand corner here. My father was in a military unit that assisted the Hungarian military with odd jobs, like cleaning the roads and building the fortifications that help with the air raid shelters, things like that. But he had the easiest time because he was in a town that was east from Budapest, and the Russians arrived there earlier. So he was actually 3 months ahead of us in getting his freedom and certainly escaping most of the horrors of the Holocaust. So that was his certificate issued by the Hungarian army. Next, you see my mother's picture up here. And she had to take a job as a dishwasher after she actually managed to obtain false papers, and I'll tell you a little more about that later. You see my picture there, which was taken a year after the war ended, and that, of course, ended the Holocaust as well. I was 9 years old in that picture. Now, on the far right, you see those shoes, and they represent actually a memorial. That was a memorial to remember the Jewish population that was taken out to the Danube in the city of Budapest, and then they were summarily shot into the water, and that's how they died. So how could this happen? Well, again, I mentioned to you the Germans occupied Hungary in March 1944. There was another major change in the country. October 15, 1954, the government resigned. They resigned because they were forced by the Germans to begin with, and they could no longer see their way out. The atrocities and the cruelty of the Nazis was beyond what even an anti-Semitic Hungarian government was willing or able to do. So they just let an ultra-Nazi fascist group take over as the government. And these people were able to continue the killing of the Jewish population even after the railroads were no longer operating. And they resorted to this method of rounding up the Jews in the city, taking them out to the bank of the river, and just shooting them in the water. Fortunately, this was not as efficient as the gas chambers, but it was efficient enough to still kill additional thousands of the Jewish population that were just summarily shot into the river. So this was the background that forced many of our relatives to actually seek shelter as best they can. We were already living in separate buildings that were identified as residence for the Jewish population. Once again, this was a way of trying to isolate the Jewish population and making them easier to find, being rounded up, and earlier taken to concentration camps and death camps, later taken to the bank of the Danube and shot into the water. My mother, being the youngest adult of our group, which was about 19 people in a 2-bedroom apartment, we were forced to live for about 4 months. She was extremely fortunate because she was taken out to the railroad station, and they were ready to put them into the railroad cars and take them to the camps. It got too late for them to do this, and they let her go home. At that point, she took me by the hand with a little bag with a couple of pieces of bread, and we went on the street just trying to find a place. She took the yellow star off our garments so they couldn't identify us as Jews right away. Unfortunately, she met someone she knew before, and that person actually took us to their apartment. She gave some false papers to my mother, and my mother was able to go into hiding. And that's the way she actually survived. That left me on my own at age 8, and this shows my journey going from the apartment where we lived with the expanded family, and my mother, of course, went into hiding. My father was in the camp that was assisting the army. So what you see here is the Budapest ghetto, which was declared a Jewish district where all the Jews had to move. And that's in the upper left-hand corner there. These gates, these fences are put up. You see the Star of David indicating this is a Jewish district, and there were police who were letting people in or out, and this was a relatively small area. This was about 6 square blocks, and this is where the Nazis were trying to squeeze close to 100,000 Jewish citizens. This is the process that I got caught up in. First, I was taken to an institution for orphans, but that didn't last long because that was broken up by the authorities. Everybody had to go into this ghetto area. We were in a roundup place, and there were about 500 people. I slept with a friend of mine in a china cabinet because there were no beds. That was only for 5 days. But everybody was getting ready to be taken into this ghetto, which the Germans actually planned to surround with explosives and blow it up. That was the final solution for the Jewish population of Hungary. Not having the death camps or the shooting into the water, this was the final way that all the Jews were going to be killed. Well, in this roundup place, where actually I met my grandparents, and I was there with a friend of mine. They were getting us ready to get into this, to be transported into this ghetto that's shown on the upper left-hand corner. And here I contracted a disease called scarlet fever, which is a very difficult disease to treat. At least it was at that time. There was no vaccination. And 2 boys and myself got the same disease. We were put into a separate room because this was a highly contagious disease of young people. And when the Hungarian Nazis came to take everybody to the ghetto, they barely opened the door of the room where we were lying in bed because they were afraid to contract the disease. So they were just going to make sure we were there. And then everybody got taken to the ghetto while we were taken to one of the most modern hospitals, which is shown here. And one of the wings of this hospital was designated for patients with scarlet fever. Most of the patients were soldiers, but the 3 of us still ended up with them. The good news was that from then on, we got 3 good meals a day and medical supervision, medical attention, and that's where we were until actually the Russians arrived. Once the Russians were near, one morning we woke up and it turned out that all the staff, all the doctors, all the nurses were gone from the hospital. So we were left on our own. There were Russian soldiers all over the street. They already invaded the city, and they were slowly driving the Germans out, trying to occupy the place. In the meantime, they blew up all the bridges over the Danube, and as you can see, there was severe damage to the royal palace, which is shown on the upper left, as well as the rest of the city was badly damaged. So we started out actually walking because there was nobody left in the hospital. And I wanted to get back to the district, which was right here by the Danube River. This is where we started. And we started walking. This was about a 10-mile walk. But this was one of the worst winters in memory. It was terribly cold. I had very poor clothing. I ended up losing whatever clothing I left along the way. And we just had about 3 stops on this journey that's shown by the arrows. And this took us 3 or 4 days until I was the only one who was left, because the 2 other boys dropped off along the way here. At this point, there was only about a mile walk left for me to get back to the district and the house, the apartment building where I used to live. At that point, I contracted a serious dysentery. I was, of course, already through with the scarlet fever. I recovered from that, but because of who knows what food I had to eat along the way, and we stayed with different people who gave us shelter, took us into their home. I ended up with a young couple who took care of me for 3 days, nursed me back to reasonable health so I can continue my journey back near the river. So at that point, this young couple who had me as their guest for 3 days told me if I cannot find my parents, my relatives, I should go back to them because they wanted to adopt me. That's all I remember, because I never heard from them or seen them again. But people were kind-hearted, at least the ones that I happened to encounter were very fortunate. So, being back in the district where I used to live, managed to rest, and my mother showed up. The next day, she was very upset because they already went out to the hospital with her aunt. They couldn't find me, but of course she was glad that we found each other. And cut a long story short, after having dealt with the Nazi regime, about 3 years later, we had the misfortune of being under a communist government. So this created other problems that I don't have time to go into details now. But you can see my identity paper on the left when I was 18 years old. And the stamp on my picture is of the Canadian government. There was a revolution which lasted only 2 weeks in Hungary that allowed a lot of people to leave, and I was one of them. So having no other possessions than the briefcase that you see on the picture on the right, I managed to end up in Canada and eventually in this country, which was a great deal of blessing because these 2 countries gave me the opportunity I could not have in Hungary, certainly not under communist rule, which lasted another 20 or 30 years after I left. So here I am on the streets of Vancouver, British Columbia, And the clothes you see, it was all donated by people to benevolent organizations. That's why it doesn't look quite matched. And you also see my journey with the big green arrow, which was a very long one, going from Budapest all the way to the west coast, which is where Vancouver is located, and eventually to Texas. Of course, there were a lot of other stops along the way, and again, we have no time to discuss those details. I want to show you a couple of pictures to illustrate the consequences of the Holocaust and the journey that I took. You see, on the upper left, my extended family here. I ended up having 4 children with my first wife. The lady I'm currently married to is sitting up next to the chair where I was sitting a little while ago. And these are my children and grandchildren and some of their families. This is part of my family that ended up in Sweden. This is my second cousin, who unfortunately passed last year. These 2 are her children, and I visited them many times, including once nearly a year ago. Up here, there is my first cousin's daughter, and these are 3 of my grandchildren that also resulted from my first marriage. So this looks like a very good-looking and nice family. There's one distinct feature that is worth pointing out. I was, of course, born into a Jewish family. Nevertheless, when I left Hungary in 1956, my mother had a heart-to-heart talk with me, and she said, maybe it's time that I forget that I was Jewish, because of all the difficulties and all the danger that came with being born Jewish. Well, it was only a few days that I forgot I was Jewish. Then I got back into the group that declared themselves Jewish, and this went back and forth until about 45 years ago, when I returned to the Jewish religion, and I've been there ever since. But I just wanted to illustrate to you the dislocation of place, your identity, your family, all that was brought about by the Holocaust. And being in this country was a tremendous blessing because of the opportunities that gave me to develop a career that I was very fond of. But again, it came with a baggage, and that is due to what was imposed by people who felt that the Jewish people had to be done away with because they were creating trouble in Germany and other places. Well, we have time. We have 15 minutes for questions. So I'm going to stop my talk right here. And I'd be glad to answer your questions if you have any.
Thank you, Dr. Lacko. I should also add that Dr. Lacko doesn't shout his own praises, but was a molecular biologist. He continues to be a molecular biologist, and he's also an internationally recognized cancer researcher. So he's very humble, but he did some amazing, amazing things. So these are some of the questions that came in from online while you were speaking. The first question is, what inspired you to tell your story, and when did you begin to share it?
Sorry?
What inspired you to tell your story, and when did you begin to share it?
Well, what inspired me is the opportunity that we moved here just 5 years ago. Previous to that, I gave maybe a handful of talks while we were living in Fort Worth, which is 25, 30 years. But once I was here and the opportunity came, and I was asked if I was interested, and I indicated that I was, and I've been doing it ever since.
What made you want to do it?
Well, what made me want to do it at the time I did it is the recognition of the fact that a lot of people, especially young people, had very little opportunity to learn about the Holocaust, and quite a few of them actually forgot or never really learned how could atrocities and cruelties and hate be experienced by people. So I wanted to give my story, and with a little bit of background to try to help them learn, at least perhaps incite their curiosity to learn more, because in my opinion, these are the type of events that really make history in our lives and in our time.
Thank you. Have you been back to Hungary since you left? And if so, what were your impressions?
Well, I've been back to Hungary many times, probably 10 or 15 times, I don't know exactly the number. And Hungary is a very unique country. You might have heard of their government, their political trends, and I could spend too much time talking about this, but Hungary is a poor country. It had a chance to become part of the European Union only late, by which time all the advantages were taken by other countries. So they relied basically on other countries to have a means of survival.
Okay. As a young child before the war, do you have any memories of when you became aware that something was going wrong?
Well, I don't know if it was going wrong, but I remember I was 3 years old, and right on the floor where we lived in the apartment building, there was a sewing shop. And there was a bunch of young ladies working there, and they really liked to take care of me, which helped my mother quite a bit. But they took me down to the air raid shelter for the first time when I was about 5 years old, and that was the first memory of the war. So I didn't know exactly what was going on, but I could tell that there was something unusual was going on.
Do you have any memories of what it was like in school before the war?
I only had uh, I only had grade 1, and this story I always tell. The first day I was in school, there was a boy who was sitting next to me, and we were getting introduced. And the first thing he asked me, why the Jews killed Jesus? Which we of course know didn't happen, but that's, and I told him I didn't know. I could not even finish grade 1 because of the restrictions that came for the Jewish population. We had to move into special building, we had a curfew, so the second semester of grade 1 I never finished. So that's how much I remember.
Okay. This comes from one of our youngest audience members, and it's a good question. If you came face to face with a Nazi, could you have lied and said you weren't Jewish? How would they have known you were Jewish?
Well, I mean, the reason my mother didn't take me when she went into hiding, because I could be identified as a Jew, and I apologize if you find this too harsh, but this is because Jewish boys get circumcised after the first week of their birth. And I also underwent that process, so it was, if somebody wanted to find out whether or not I was Jewish, it would have been fairly easy to find out.
What do you remember about being under Soviet occupation after the war ended? And then the second part of this was, did you ever see any American soldiers in Budapest, or was it just the Soviets?
Well, I'll tell you, this is another event that I remember, I will never forget. Right next to the building where we lived, I was walking down the street, and I tried to cross the street, not at the intersection, but in the middle of the block. And right behind me, two American soldiers with a Jeep stopped because I stumbled. And they actually spoke Hungarian. And they told me that I shouldn't be doing this. So that was, but there were hardly any American soldiers. The American embassy was a very popular place later on, because that's where you could see the most modern cars, and people used to go there just, to look around. You asked me about the Russians?
Yeah.
For me, because the Holocaust, frankly, for me, was more like a game. I was too young. And as you could tell, I had a pretty easy time compared to a lot of people due to scarlet fever and other things. But what really impacted my life is that I couldn't even go to the high school that I wanted to. And you mentioned about my professional activities. Well, even at that age, I wanted to study chemistry, and I could not take the path that would allow me to do that. When I graduated from a school where I was fortunate to have the right kind of teachers, I was number one in my class, and yet I could not go to a university that I wanted to because of my social background that was considered a negative. So it wasn't enough that I was Jewish, which was not a problem with the communists, but they were after you if you belonged to the wrong social class. And my parents had a grocery store, so we were capitalists. So that was a strike against you, and that you carried with you. So I couldn't even go to the right high school, let alone the right university where I wanted to go. So I had to wait until I got to Canada and eventually United States, where I could study exactly what I felt like.
Okay. To follow up on that, what happened to your parents after the war?
Well, as I mentioned, I got together with my mother fairly quickly. My father returned a couple of months later. They opened up their store again, and they did very well until the communists shut them down. And they were able to get an apartment. We even had a summer home that they managed to get enough money to buy after 3 years. But then everything got shut down. Eventually they came out to Canada after me, and they are buried in Vancouver.
Okay. What did you have to eat in Budapest during and after the war?
When was
No,
it?
what did you have to
What,
eat
but when?
during the war and then after the war?
Okay, well, that's a good question. There was quite a bit of depravity and difficulties after the war because there was no electricity, and it was very cold, and there were dead horses on the street that people were cutting up to eat. And being in the city, stores are not open, so we had to rely on whatever we had. And my mother was trading some of her clothing for vegetables, and we begged Russian soldiers for food on the street, my cousin and I. The Russian soldiers like kids, so we usually got some bread at least that we took home. So this was the scenario that prevailed for about 2 or 3 weeks, and it got gradually better after that.
Okay. Can you share a little bit about your career after the war and what inspired you to pursue that career?
Okay, well, this can be a long story, so I'll try to cut it short. Jewish children have an opportunity to undergo a special ceremony. For boys, it's called a bar mitzvah. For girls, it's called a bat mitzvah. And that's supposed to be an entry into adulthood, which happens at age 13. By far the best present I got for my 13th birthday was a chemistry set. So that was a huge boost toward doing what I'm still doing today. And again, I got very fortunate because the high school I went to was sort of a makeshift place. It was a high school for food industry, but there were 3 outstanding teachers that were put into a high school for political reasons, and they all 3 had doctoral degrees. Interestingly, one was a mathematician, another one was a chemist, and the third one was a microbiologist. So that was perfectly fitting my plans to move on, and eventually was a big help once I chose my professional orientation.
One final comment, and then I'll conclude. And this is from one of our attendees, and it says, "Thank you for your courage and generosity for helping to educate the public about what you lived through." So the conclusion is as follows, ladies and gentlemen. We'd like to first of all thank Dr. Lacko for sharing his story with us today, and to thank you, the audience, for joining us here today and spending your spring break with us. We will continue our series tomorrow with second-generation survivor Ron Schwarz, whose father's journey from Nazi Germany to safety depended on courage, secrecy, and a risky escape over 2+ international borders. You'll come tomorrow if you want to hear more. And we hope that you can join us. Dr. Lacko will stay on stage for a few minutes,
Okay.
I hope. If you'd like to come up the ramp and say hello to him. And thank you so much, and safe travels.
Thank you.